So thank you very much for your time. We are very excited to be participating in collaboration with Tatler in this event today. The idea behind it was the kinship between Monaco and Singapore. You're going to learn more about the things that we do in Monaco, but I wanted to insist on that. We thought that Monaco was an interesting case study. It's a city-state, it's small, it's surrounded by bigger economies and bigger territories and countries. Just like Singapore, Monaco also does not have resources, so it needs to exercise its brain to actually make it happen and to keep its position as a country and as a society. Monaco also obviously needs to address those issues around global warming, the energy transition, and all those topics that we're going to discuss today. It also has the same constraints as Singapore in terms of density. The population in Monaco is one of the densest population in the world, which obviously trickles down into social issues, into potentially anyway, because the life in Monaco is wonderful, but that's also because things are done right. So all these things put together make a kinship that I think is incontrovertible between Monaco and Singapore. And just before we left our office, Xiaowei is a witness, we remember that we recorded this little sequence with Minister Iswaran, who all of you know, the senior minister of Singapore's government. And he's going to actually give you a little address and that will reinforce our idea of kinship.
So Jessica joins us virtually today from Monaco, and she will share more about the work that she's done, as well as how she is transforming Monaco to become a greener city-state. So Benoit will be the one that's interviewing her, so I'll pass the time over to Benoit as well as Jessica to give you some
Nous sommes en ligne, Jessica, bonjour.
Bonjour. Hello, how are you?
C'est moi qui vais te poser les questions, okay? I'm going to ask the questions, not Xiaowei. So you have somebody familiar. All right. So first of all, I think it's interesting that you share how you created Terrae in the context of Monaco.
Sorry for my bad English, okay? I'm Swiss and I living in Monaco for 12 years. 6 years ago, I was in phase where I was asking myself existential question, like what do I want to do with my life? What do I want to leaving behind? And I remember my parents, they are a garden, and the taste of the vegetable was so beautiful. And I remember this taste. And I started to cultivate in my very small balcony in Monaco. And I was relaxing. I was proud of me to eat some salad or basilic. It was very good. And I persuaded my neighbor on the right and on the left to grow. And one day I saw the roof of the building in Monaco and sad and empty. So I decided I want to cultivate on the rooftop. And I training myself in permaculture is like organic. And in 2016, I create my society Terrae.
Very good. So permaculture, you said. Huh? I don't know if everyone is familiar
permaculture.
With this. Okay. So
it's like organic.
Yes. From Terre de Monaco to Terrae, which is now the name of your company, what were the challenges, the experiences, and the successes that you met?
Mm-hmm. To begin, my company produce urban agriculture, in particular ecologic vegetable garden, which are made with the value of organic and permaculture, which are to take care of the earth and human. I cultivate in the ground and on the roof of building. And the second value about human beings is to do a lot of pedagogy by transmitting my passion as much as possible which course.
Recording in progress.
Sorry?
Tout va bien. Tout
Ça
va bien.
va?
Continue.
Okay.
Oui, oui.
Okay. Which course for young and old, for young and old. In the end, we have vegetable with quality, with taste. We create social links. We recycle, and it's turned out that the urban farm can be exported to another cities. In 1 year, a very large urban terrain farm will be in Belgium with a 40 meter square, is very big, in a
4,000 square
roofing
meters.
of a roofing over on outlet. And in 2 years, another farm, a little more small, 0 meter square on 8 new building in Nice in French. Okay. And there are other projects on the way. So maybe just a just a little more. The bigger challenge in agriculture and ever more in urban agriculture is to find an economic balance by doing projects on human scale. They offer something more virtuous, which is good for people and does not degrade the planet.
About small countries, were there specific opportunities that were offered to you by Monaco? We're also thinking about Singapore, which is also a small country.
I often say if it did it in Monaco with all disadvantage, I mean 100 years agriculture not longer existed. It's very urbanized. The square meter is very expensive. There is little to no land. You can do it in almost any other city. And Singapore seems like a perfect example. So who knows, maybe one day we'll come maybe one day will come and I do a terrain urban farm in Singapore. I would love that, and I invite all developers and architects in your city to contact me, that you make sure a great and symbolic bilateral collaboration between Monaco and Singapore.
How did you convince everyone around you? I remember that years ago you told me a joke. You said, oh, in the beginning everybody thought that I was a blonde girl who was going to plant 3 tomatoes. So how did you convince people around you, and how did you make it work?
By working hard to demonstrate the results. It's not theory, it's fact. Look, yeah. Maybe you can feel it, but I'm very, very passionate.
We do feel it. Okay, and so a question that always comes back to all people who are militants and advocates. How do you keep the faith? How do you keep your enthusiasm regardless of the hard work and all the setbacks that you have to face?
I teach children in school, and I saw how useful I am. I educate more than 2,000 children on year, and I'm sure there will be memories like me and my parents, and that they will be better. Learning to garden is learning the passage of time. To respect one's remain connection, one's environment, and it's also help to remain connected to the earth and therefore to humanity.
Those are great values. Thank you very much. Please, I would like you to stay on if you don't mind, because I think that we're going to have a few questions. So, on to you.
Jessica,
Thank you, Jessica.
Okay.
Stay,
Hi.
reste là, hein, reste avec nous.
Yeah.
Hi, Jessica. I hope you can see me.
Hi.
I'm here.
Yes.
So let me get the ball rolling by asking you the first question, because I think Benoit has been asking all the questions. But I'm curious, actually. So you were previously a professional tennis player, as well as a fashion model. So what made you transition to become an entrepreneur, especially in urban farming?
Tout simplement parce que je cherchais quelque chose qui donnait du sens à ma vie et qui avait une valeur ajoutée sur cette terre. Okay. C'est la grande différence avec ce que j'ai fait avant.
Okay, she wanted to find purpose. She says that she's found purpose that she didn't find as a tennis player or as a fashion model, that she was finding the purpose that she was looking for.
Bonjour Jessica, je vais me permettre de parler en français, je pense que c'est plus facile pour toi. I can translate after. Oui, alors d'abord, c'est très inspirant de t'écouter. J'ai une petite question parce que j'ai déjà essayé d'avoir une farm chez moi, mais j'ai pas réussi. Et il y a en fait ici une petite start-up à Singapour qui s'appelle Farm City. C'est un couple qui a des petits colis qui arrivent chez toi et ça t'explique comment commencer et tout ça. Mais on a essayé comment ça se dit, my husband.
Mon mari.
Mon mari, voilà. Mon mari et moi, mais c'était difficile. Donc, en fait, quel est ton conseil quand quelqu'un veut commencer? Donc, est-ce que tu peux le faire dans n'importe quel climat? Est-ce qu'il y a des considérations à tenir en compte? Par exemple, au Singapour, je ne sais pas si tu peux faire tous les légumes, et voilà. Donc, quel est le conseil pour commencer? Est-ce qu'il... parce qu'on a capitulé, en fait. On s'est dit, c'est trop compliqué. Voilà. Donc, comment commencer et comment c'est plus facile les premiers pas?
Okay, I'm going to translate quickly. It was difficult for you to start an urban gardening project that you thought about with your husband. And although you were inspired by a company in Singapore, Farm City, which delivers little parcels with urban gardening, organically grown produce, you just sort of gave up. So what are your advice, Jessica, when it comes to starting such a venture, even on a personal basis? Can you grow anything? Are all climates good to start what you started? Et voilà.
Alors, effectivement, il faut prendre en compte son environnement. Pour avoir des légumes, il faut avoir minimum 4 à 5 heures de soleil. Il faut effectivement savoir connaître les légumes qui sont de saison, qui poussent chez vous.
Arrête-toi.
Oui.
So first of all, you need to think about the sun. You need 5 hours of sun at least if you want to grow anything. And you need also to understand which vegetables or fruits will be successful in your particular climate.
Ensuite, il faut effectivement avoir une bonne terre qui soit équilibrée pour les légumes. Donc souvent, on met du terreau avec un peu d'engrais, de fumier pour avoir une terre qui soit fertile. Et il faut un minimum de 50 cm de terre.
And you need 50 centimeters of depth in your pots if you want to grow good roots and be successful in your endeavor.
Et évidemment, si on veut que ça pousse, il faut de l'eau. Et donc, il faut pouvoir arroser soi-même, soit régulièrement, ou avoir peut-être un arrosage automatique.
Okay, watering is also crucial. It needs to be done consistently. So you can't just go to Phuket and come back 4 days later and deplore the fact that your tomatoes are dead.
Et aussi, il faut avoir de la patience, ce qu'on n'a plus beaucoup aujourd'hui. Parce que voilà, il faut donner du temps à ce produit pour qu'il grandisse et il faut effectivement donner de l'amour, du coup.
Yeah, you need patience and love.
Maintenant, je vois pourquoi j'ai pas réussi. Now I see why I didn't succeed.
I'm sure that you don't lack patience or love. Maybe you lack the soil or the sun exposure. I don't know.
Yeah.
Hi, Jessica. This is David. So,
Hello.
I'm a little bit in agriculture. I plant rice myself. I'm just curious, among all the different methods you could have chosen to grow your crops on a rooftop, you could have done hydroponic, you could have done aquaponic, but why do you choose to do permaculture then? Thank you.
Pourquoi est-ce que tu as choisi la permaculture plutôt que l'agriculture hydroponique, etc.?
C'est une très bonne question parce que en plus je suis une fervente défenseuse de la permaculture et des choses naturelles. La permaculture ou simplement
she's a militant on permaculture. She's going to explain why. Vas-y.
Pour avoir un produit de qualité nutritif et gustatif, on est obligé, parce qu'on ne peut pas faire mieux que la nature, c'est de faire avec de la vraie terre et un vrai soleil. Quand vous partez sur l'hydroponie et l'aquaponie, ce sont d'autres agricultures qui sont utiles pour la planète parce qu'on va être beaucoup sur Terre et effectivement, il va falloir produire plus de façon concentrée. Peut-être tu veux déjà traduire ça?
Oui. So she thinks, and she was taught, because she actually trained herself very seriously with one of the French specialists in permaculture. She thinks that to have good produce with taste, you need the sun and the soil, which is what nature does, basically. She says that hydroponic methods are very valuable because of the fact that we need to produce in large quantities considering the population on Earth, but that those are two different things. Continue.
Et effectivement, l'hydroponie ou l'aquaponie, quand on fait l'analyse des produits, d'ailleurs aujourd'hui on a 80% de la production mondiale qui est fait en hydroponie, mais on constate un vrai appauvrissement nutritionnel. Et ma façon de faire, elle est ancienne, très ancienne, parce que c'est ce qu'on faisait il y a 70 ans. Mais elle reste la plus valorisée au niveau de la santé. Pour la santé, c'est la meilleure.
Okay. She says that, in fact, hydroponic or aquaponic produce represent 80% of the world's vegetables, mostly, but that in terms of taste and possibly in terms of nutrients, it might not equal the permaculture. And she says that permaculture is actually just what things, just the way things were done before, when we didn't have phytosanitary products, when we didn't have all these techniques that we use today for mass production of vegetable and fruits. And so she's just doing that, basically. She's doing what we once did. Okay.
All right.
Merci, Jessica.
Merci à vous.
Thank you, Jessica. So for the next 10 minutes, we will hear from Estelle Antonielli, head of the Corporate Social Responsibility Department at the Monaco Government Tourists and Convention Authority. So Estelle will be sharing a little bit more about how Monaco is transforming itself as a destination not only for luxury tourism, but also responsible tourism.
Bonjour à tous, je m'appelle Estelle Antonielli, je travaille à la direction du tourisme et des congrès de Monaco depuis une vingtaine d'années. Au départ au sein de l'administration générale, puis pour le service communication. Et depuis 2015, je suis en charge de la cellule tourisme responsable. Donc les missions de cette cellule sont de promouvoir toutes les actions de tourisme responsable menées par les partenaires, les fédérés et également sensibiliser les visiteurs au tourisme responsable. Cette mission et ce poste viennent d'évoluer, cela fait à peine quelques jours, mais la cellule tourisme responsable a évolué en cellule RSE, responsabilité sociale et environnementale. Donc c'est un beau challenge pour moi, hein, puisque au-delà de l'aspect promotionnel et fédérateur, il s'agit maintenant de créer, avec les partenaires bien sûr, une vraie politique RSE pour la destination, mais également en interne, donc pour le personnel de la direction du tourisme. Donc quand on parle de cellules tourisme responsable, ou lorsqu'on parle de tourisme responsable, je tiens à préciser que il ne s'agit pas que d'environnement. Il faut prendre en compte l'aspect social et sociétal, et c'est justement ce que nous allons faire de plus en plus au sein de cette nouvelle cellule. J'ai repris la cellule tourisme responsable en 2015. Très vite, en fait, je me suis rendu compte que c'était un beau challenge puisque je pouvais partir d'une page blanche et modeler le service à ma façon, tout en, bien sûr, suivant la feuille de route du souverain et en appuyant sur l'aide des partenaires. Et bien oui, depuis 2015, en fait, je trouve ce travail très très enrichissant. C'est un sujet passionnant, hein, et il y a une vraie volonté de démarche de développement durable à Monaco. C'est aussi mais c'est aussi un challenge en fait, parce que on connaît tous Monaco. Hein, Monaco est connu pour être une destination de tourisme de luxe, et cette perception, cette image, il faut non pas la faire changer, puisque le tourisme de luxe est dans l'ADN de la principauté, mais prouver que la destination peut être à la fois une destination de tourisme de luxe, mais responsable, et que les deux termes ne sont pas antinomiques. Alors c'est mon travail au quotidien de le prouver et montrer que oui, Monaco, c'est le luxe, le glamour. Il y a on a un casino, on a un Grand Prix, mais il y a également de vraies actions qui sont menées au quotidien par les partenaires au niveau touristique. Et voilà, il faut juste que ces deux notions arrivent et qu'on comprenne qu'elles peuvent coexister. En fait, je pense que dans toutes les destinations, il y a un peu de ça. Rien n'est à 100% responsable et rien n'est à 100% mauvais. Dans toutes les destinations, il y a des contradictions, je pense. Et voilà, l'objectif, c'est de savoir jouer avec ces contradictions. Oui, à cette question, je répondrai incontestablement oui. En tout cas, les missions se sont énormément étoffées. Effectivement, au début, l'idée, c'était de promouvoir les actions, les premières démarches, puisque certains étaient déjà fortement engagés, hein, notamment le secteur hôtelier, mais pour d'autres, c'était encore de la niche, et les enjeux n'étaient pas encore bien perçus. Donc voilà, c'était de la promotion, et pour certains, c'était surtout montrer Monaco sous un angle inattendu. Le sujet était moins pris au sérieux. À la limite, voilà, c'était un bon angle de communication. Mais voilà, en quelques années, ça a énormément changé. Les acteurs aujourd'hui sont tous conscients de l'importance du développement durable et de la promotion et du développement d'un tourisme responsable. D'ailleurs, ce n'est pas pour rien si au sein de la direction du tourisme, la cellule tourisme responsable devient une véritable cellule RSE, puisque, hein, comme je l'expliquais tout à l'heure, l'idée est bien sûr toujours de faire la promotion des actions, mais également de mener une vraie stratégie, d'avoir une vraie stratégie et mener une vraie politique de développement durable au sein du secteur touristique à Monaco. À cette question, j'ai envie de répondre que le développement durable, en fait, c'est l'affaire de tous. On a tous notre rôle à jouer. Et bien évidemment, s'il y a un leader charismatique qui est là pour impulser une dynamique, bien forcément, c'est incontestablement une grande aide. Si je prends l'exemple de Monaco, dès le début du XXe siècle, à Monaco, le prince Albert Ier incitait à la préservation des océans. Donc c'est déjà quelque chose qui est ancré au sein, je pense, de la population à Monaco, et l'engagement est de plus en plus présent avec le prince Albert II, puisque depuis son avènement en 2005, le prince souverain a fait du développement durable une priorité. Il mène une politique très forte au niveau de l'environnement, au niveau du développement durable, et il a fixé un objectif très fort pour la principauté, celui d'être carbone neutre d'ici 2050. Donc pour atteindre un objectif si ambitieux, eh bien forcément, il faut que tous les secteurs, les résidents, le secteur public, le secteur privé, mènent des actions pour arriver à cet objectif. Donc voilà, il faut l'adhésion de tous, et bien sûr le secteur touristique n'est pas en reste. Et d'ailleurs à Monaco, le secteur touristique a été un des premiers à s'engager. Alors aujourd'hui, le tourisme responsable en principauté, c'est vraiment tout un secteur qui s'engage. C'est 88% d'hôtels certifiés avec des certifications environnementales telles que Green Globe, Gen.T, Planète 21. Les certifications, c'est vrai, ne sont pas forcément une fin en soi, hein, mais si je les mentionne, c'est parce que les établissements s'imposent un cahier des charges très contraignant pour les obtenir. Et c'est ça qui est important en fait. Donc 88% d'hôtels certifiés, 97% des hôtels qui sont signataires du Pacte national pour la transition énergétique. On a 20% du territoire qui est couvert d'espaces verts, des espaces verts qui sont traités avec des produits biologiques. On a des centres de congrès qui sont éco-conçus, une gastronomie responsable avec des chefs qui ont une réelle volonté de travailler avec des produits frais, locaux, de saison. C'est une destination qui développe des solutions originales en termes de mobilité douce, à la fois pour les résidents mais aussi donc pour les visiteurs, et une destination qui est accessible aux personnes à mobilité réduite. Donc vraiment aujourd'hui, au sein de la destination, il y a une prise de conscience générale. Tous les acteurs travaillent dans la même mouvance. Ils sont sensibilisés, ils ont des connaissances en termes de développement durable. Mais c'est aussi le cas des visiteurs, puisqu'on s'aperçoit de plus en plus, et d'autant plus depuis la pandémie, qu'il y a une réelle demande au niveau de nos clients. Aujourd'hui, il est de plus en plus nécessaire de diminuer les impacts négatifs du tourisme sur les destinations et voire contribuer à améliorer l'impact, à avoir un impact positif donc. Et c'est ce vers quoi nous tendons à la direction du tourisme. C'est pour ça qu'en 2020, nous avons décidé de réaliser un livre blanc avec l'aide des partenaires et d'autres départements du gouvernement. Donc ça a été un travail collégial, une réflexion commune que nous avons eue tous ensemble pendant presque une année et qui nous a permis d'établir un état des lieux de ce qu'était le tourisme responsable à Monaco à l'instant T. Et donc grâce à ce document, nous savons aujourd'hui quelles sont nos forces, quelles sont nos faiblesses, et nous avons défini des pistes d'amélioration que nous avons groupées autour de 5 axes stratégiques qui sont former et sensibiliser, communiquer et améliorer la visibilité, minimiser et maîtriser les impacts environnementaux de la destination, renforcer le tourisme pour tous et par tous, et enfin mesurer, puisque sans indicateurs, nous ne pouvons pas nous améliorer correctement. Voilà où nous en sommes aujourd'hui. Un plan d'action est sur le point d'être lancé. Nous l'avons travaillé en interne et il va être très prochainement envoyé aux partenaires pour information et surtout pour que tous ensemble on mène des actions autour de ces 5 thématiques de façon à faire de Monaco une destination de plus en plus responsable.
So on Netflix, I think some of you might have watched the disaster satire movie called Don't Look Up, starring Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence. So they are, for context, I think maybe some of you might not have watched it. So they are two astronomers basically trying to warn humankind of a planet-killing comet. I see beyond you're nodding your head. So that planet-killing comet is actually approaching Earth, and obviously it's going to annihilate humankind if we don't do anything about it. So I think the movie actually quite interestingly points to one of the biggest challenges that climate activists, as well as environmental activists, scientists, and people on the ground who are either studying the planet or working to save it, which is a difficulty in kind of convincing policy makers, decision makers, as well as people in general, humankind in general, to do something to save the world, even in the face of a climate emergency. So studies have actually shown that climate scientists, as well as professionals in the field, have experienced emotional toll whenever they talk about climate change, whenever they communicate about climate change, and when they inform policymakers and decision makers and see their information either being ignored or misinterpreted. So that's something that we're going to talk about during our panel discussion, because it's a very, I would say, underserved conversation to have, and it's an important one that people need to know about. So we have invited two panelists to join us today, and I will introduce you to them right now. So first up, we have Dr. Neo Mei Lin, who is a Gen.T honoree. Yes, you can come up here. So Dr. Neo Mei Lin is a senior research fellow at the Tropical Marine Science Institute at NUS, the National University of Singapore. So she's a trained marine ecologist, and her research focuses on finding experimental approaches to studying the interactions of marine organisms with the environment. So she has a particular fascination with giant clams, and you can ask her later about it. But she's even done a TED Talk that has garnered 1.2 million views just on the secret life of giant clams. Yes. So really interesting stuff. So Mei Lin is also joined by Mark Allen. So Mark is a co-founder of Unravel Carbon, which is a climate tech startup that is... So Unravel Carbon is a climate tech startup that is developing a software solution to help companies track and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So how it does that is by converting companies' accounting data into carbon data. So Mark is a chemical engineer by training, but he has actually spent the last 15 years working in climate change and sustainability. And I believe you've worked with some of the world's largest companies to develop strategic responses to climate change. So welcome both. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Mei Lin, if I can invite you to the center.
No, you're going to sit in the middle.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
We're trying to figure out. It's weird sort of sitting on a couch. Do you relax? Do you want me to lie down? I don't know.
Up to you. I think it's a pretty relaxed conversation. So
I'll lie down then.
So welcome both. Maybe just a very easy question to start with. Maybe just to set context on what your background is. Maybe you can tell us what is your story. Why did you decide to enter marine ecology and conservation for Mei Lin, as well as to start a climate tech startup for you? So Mei Lin, maybe you want to go first?
Yeah, so my story started about 15 years ago when I was a student in the university. So I'm genuinely very curious about the environment and nature. So it was sort of no surprise to me, taking up a degree that was relevant in the university. But I think it was more of the experiences that I have in the university that led me to where I am today. Going into the whole idea of research and what do we do as a researcher as well, spending a lot of time in the field, but also a lot of time actually locked up in laboratories as well, just trying to study and understand how animals work, how they behave, but also in the context of environmental changes as well, especially in the last few years, bringing in bigger conversations like climate change, and also even just other topical issues like, fishing and something like this. So, being able to delve, or no pun intended, but dive in deeper into the subject matter, realizing, the role that we play in many of these problems that we see today. But also coming to realize from a conservation perspective, a little bit of an advocate, although we're going to discuss a little bit about activism later, is the fact that I I think we humans generally have power to destroy, but we also have the power to come up with solutions as well. So that's where I'm coming from. Is I see myself as being one of the movers to move things in a more positive way, leaving a more positive environmental legacy.
Thank you so much, Mark. What about
thanks.
you?
So yeah, I'll answer in two parts. One, how did I get into climate change, right? And you know, I'm a chemical engineer. Why would I want to work in climate change in the first place? And then, of course, why I'm now doing something in climate tech, which is actually new and exciting, and all these cool things. But yeah, so you know, I've been working for a long time, over 20 years since I graduated, and of that, over 15 years, I've spent working in climate change. Now, what actually happened was I was just working as an engineer. I was a production manager at an industrial gases facility, right? And I ended up working in the hydrogen space. I had a hydrogen plant all of my own and supplying a mine site. And I got seconded onto a project to construct and build and then commission and operate Australia's first hydrogen refueling station in Perth in 2004, right, which is really early for hydrogen fuel cells and things. And so I worked in this project for 3 years, supplying all the hydrogen and refueling buses and all this fun stuff. And, you know, for me, it was really quite eye-opening that there were things out there in the engineering world and in chemical engineering that you could use for something positive, for something good, right? Because throughout the whole university degree, you're just taught to make more widgets, right? That's the whole purpose of a chemical engineer. How do you make more widgets and how do you make them cheaper? But I had this realization that, you know, solving some of these sustainability related issues takes a lot of technical work, right? And climate change is surprisingly technical. And the solutions are all really technical, you know, hydrogen and renewables and carbon capture and storage and all these things that are required. And that's the realm of chemical engineers. So I decided, I had a look at sustainability more broadly and thought, oh, you know, it's a pretty broad church. What's the area that I want to look in back in 2007? And anyone who was in Australia in 2007 would know that both parties went to the election as a climate change election then. And I'm like, oh, this climate change thing looks like it's going to be important politically, it's going to be important for businesses, and going to be important for everyone, right, to reduce emissions. And decided that'll be the area that I focus, and then worked in a whole number of places, consultancies and big companies, and did, you know, sort of morphed into strategy development. So then how did I end up in climate tech, right? So this has been a long slog over the last 15 years trying to convince companies that you should do something about climate change. And, you know, everything's changed in the last sort of 18 months. It feels like climate change is a flash in the pan, but you remember the Rio Earth Summit and the creation of the UNFCCC, the UN body, was in 1992. So we've been doing this for a very long time. So now this move into the climate tech space is about how do I have most impact, right? So I was running a consulting company before, and you can help a number of clients, but you're limited by time. That's consulting life, right? You can only deal with as many clients as you can deal with in an 8 to X hour day. So leveraging technology means we can just get to more people more quickly and sort of take this 15 years and turn it into sort of something that's for want of a better word, scalable, right? And try and achieve sort of real sort of emissions reductions or enable emissions reductions in a meaningful way to a whole bunch of businesses that might not otherwise be able to afford like a highly expensive consultant to do this work. So here I am.
So Unravel Carbon has been around for a year, right?
No, not even.
Not even a year.
No. So me and my co-founder Grace, we had a discussion about this last September. So she's been thinking about it for some time. And we touched base last September, and I'm like, oh, I'm in. Let's do this thing, right? And in fact, I was in instantly because that's been something I've been thinking of for a long time as well. But we've only been on operations since January.
So let's talk about terms. So there's a term called activist. I think it's being used in the news a lot right now with Greta Thunberg coming up in the news, in the global headlines. And the word activist has almost always been associated with some negative stereotypes. Would you consider yourself first as an activist? And what are your thoughts on the state of climate activism in general today?
Yeah, look, I am very supportive of climate activism in general. When I was a lot younger, I went to plenty of protests. I never attended a protest in Singapore because I was had an EP. I'm not allowed to. So, but went to many in Australia in my early days. So, yeah, there's an interesting line, I think, between sort of activism and sort of how we engage with businesses as well, because businesses don't want, that sort of view, but they're receptive to the message. So I think that's important. So, it's about being an activist and pushing this message and explaining the urgency, which is actually the key, right? So, and it's the thing that Extinction Rebellion and Greta Thunberg and all these people are talking about. They're like sitting there going, it's been 30 years, what are you doing? You've got nothing to show for it, right? Realistically, there's actually quite a lot to show for it. A lot has happened in the policy space. But, and we're starting to see sort of the fruits of that, but there's a lot more to do. So, I highly respect activists. I'm not sure I'm bold enough to glue myself to something, or I'm not sure I particularly want to be arrested, but I can see why, and particularly now the scientific community, which is actually the really interesting thing, right? So scientists, normally, stuff here, I'm doing my research and I'm in my university, they're the ones out there going, hey, we've been telling you, you need to do something and you're not really listening. And some might say there's a communication gap happening there. But they're the ones starting to get out there, which, and look, full power to them. I will support what they do every day in whatever way I can, and also bring that conversation into boardrooms, which is actually where it needs to be, and with policymakers, and try and sort of affect change from top down as well.
What about you, Mei-Lin? Do you consider yourself an activist?
Very frankly, I've always used the term advocate or advocacy. So I prefer that, maybe also because it has a less negative connotation to it. Although my professors always point to me and say, like, you, this environmental activist going out there talking to people or writing things like that. But I mean, my form of activism is really about communicating science as early as I can remember, because very, very purely on the motivation of, like, I want more people to learn about the work that I do. Because as a scientist, we spend a lot of time doing research. We're really in that little tiny space. We're not very far off from what Mark was sharing. And we've been in this space for such a long time. In some bit like building our own little isolation or in silos, that we've slowly come to realize that actually we really need to be out there. And surprisingly, it's actually, although it might think, people might think that, like, oh, it's so obvious, we need people to put the evidence there, maybe people will accept or be more accepting to the evidence. But actually, there are still people who don't trust science. There's a lot of distrust. In big arenas like, World Economic Forum, we actually talk about how people or the general public has very, very strong distrust in science. It's either, for many reasons, they don't trust the person who's talking about it, they don't trust that we've done enough, and just generally, maybe even how we present ourselves. Because, like, to some extent, we might be seen as an activist. And then to them, that brings about a certain, fear that, like, oh, you're gonna be not talking nonsense, but basically very unapproachable. And unfortunately, many scientists are like that as well, because we spend so much time in our own little space that we actually fail to learn how to communicate effectively. So very, very few of us, and even my own community, we're considered quite outspoken already, but there's only still very few of us are effective enough to really talk about the research that we do, or even talk about why it matters to the general public as well. And it's actually, it took many, many years, in certain contexts, like how we eventually be able to come out of our own space and be able to be comfortable and talk to people. So even like Xiaowei, thanks for introducing my TED Talk, but it is through my TED experience that I've gotten that opportunity to learn how to communicate. And I didn't realize, like even years later, if someone asked me what I would do to change my career or in conservation, it would be to actually take a class in science communication properly. So I'm really just on the job training, learning how to engage with different audiences, and I've always talked to a certain set of audience, and it's the way I talk about science, people don't understand. But then now I've learned how to actually be able to reach out to more people in a different way. To me, like, it's actually a science of its own. But many of us don't just get that opportunity because we're still very busy. Our heads are only just very focused on the work that we want to do.
So do you think what's reflected in Don't Look Up, the movie, what Jennifer Lawrence and Leonardo DiCaprio went through, the difficulty of actually communicating and convincing your policymakers and decision makers, it's actually a reflection of reality, of maybe challenges that the both of you have faced before?
Yeah, definitely for me, or at least that's what I felt at the start as well. Using Singapore as the example and the context, when I started, I was very young as well. And I learned from the veterans who have been doing it for many, many years. And just one example that I can share is that, a very senior professor of mine, he retired and he's about 80 over already. And in his entire lifetime of almost 50 years of marine science and conservation career, he only saw the one outcome, which a lot of us have looked forward to, is our very first marine park, which is a protected area or a properly protected area. And that took him 50 years to see. And for me, being in the sort of the younger generation, to me, it might look shorter, but the fact is that that there was so much more behind the legacy of footwork being done that people don't quite appreciate that. So a lot of us see that, oh wow, we have a marine park, but we don't quite realize how much work and history actually went in as well. How much that actually a lot of them have already tried engaging with policymakers and the government and agencies at that time. But I mean, being in that sort of in-between phase of seeing how we are doing things very differently right now. I think there's a lot more engagement by our government and agencies also. And there's a lot of interest, in moving conversations with stakeholders as well. And I feel very fortunate to be be part of this whole thing, especially during this time, being able to really see that my voice matters, my knowledge matters, the work I do matter as well in a certain context. Of course, it's not all always positive or optimistic. It is actually an ongoing conversation that we have to keep going, because one thing is that government changes, or maybe not government change in Singapore's context, but rather people in the agencies and the officers, they change a lot. Every time we start a conversation, it takes a while to get their trust and then get things going, and then someone quits, change the job, and then we have a completely new person that we have to restart again. That's really very tiring. And at some point, I see this as really a marathon. We can't give up in that sense. But yeah, there'll be times where we're just tired and we just don't want to do anything for the time being.
Before we talk about the tiredness, I think that is a topic that we should talk about. What about you? You are, what do you say? Sorry.
Being tired, okay. No.
So Mark, you deal with a lot with businesses. How is the process? Do they come to you? Do you guys seek them out? Or
today, in 2022, they come to me. Everyone wants to know about climate change. It's crazy, right? So I guess, first of all, when I watched Don't Look Up, which I assume everyone did, but it was all very, very familiar, right? I'm like, oh, I live this. This is my life every day, right? And certainly in the early days, so 2007, and you would talk to people who were in the offset market, because that was going bananas at the time, right? All these CDM projects going everywhere. So there was that sort of bubbliness, frothiness in the market. But to talk about sort of climate change to a business and say, hey, you need to reduce your emissions because you're exposed to some risk. That was really, really challenging, right? Businesses just did not want to hear it. That they would, so you had to, what I was doing was reframing it. It's like, so it's not about reducing emissions, it's actually about reducing your energy use, right? This is about reducing your electricity or your diesel or your petrol, right? And then you save money and win-win. Everyone's happy, we reduce emissions and that's all good, right? If there was a discussion about climate and reducing emissions, it would sit within CSR, corporate social responsibility. In the last few years, right, it's moved. So climate change has moved from being an environmental thing or sitting with the sustainability team, right? And it's actually this realization by businesses that it's actually a business risk and it sits within the strategy department, right? Because, if you take the view that every business, their core reason for being is to continue to be a business and return money to shareholders. And that's what they're there for, to make profit. And climate change poses a risk to that, and quite a serious risk. You might need to change your business model. You might need to, you might have high emissions, so your high carbon price will do something, all these things, right? So there's been this sort of almost light switch on that say, this is actually something important. We need to incorporate this thinking into our business strategy, right, into our strategic decisions. The real big driver for that, and the reason that conversation is easier in 2022, two drivers. One, social license to operate is huge, right? Being seen to be doing the right thing in the business world is huge, right? And we can't actually discount that. And the rise of not activists, but things like shareholder activists, right? So groups like Follow This and Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility, and even now it's come up to like big investors, BlackRock and Vanguard and all these guys who are now going, we think our money might be at risk and we're investing long term. And that's really changed the narrative, because now companies like, what if we don't get any equity, or what if we can't raise debt, right? What if we can't get money? That's a really big issue. And, it's happening with long-term institutional investors. It's been happening a little bit with lenders, but they've got a little bit more shorter-term focus. And if anyone's been watching the news this week, there's been some news about a guy at HSBC who got caught saying the quiet bit out loud, and saying, we only really care about what happens in the next 6 years. We don't care if Miami's underwater at the end of the century. I'm like, ouch. So that'll be his last public statement for HSBC, I suspect. That view of investors and lenders has really, really changed the narrative from a business point of view. So it becomes easier and easier to have these conversations, and because they see that something's happening and they need to understand it.
So I think let's talk about the emotional toll that sometimes working in the environmental space or trying to push for sustainability can have on you guys. So we've heard about something called climate anxiety, and I think that's happening around the world right now. But we don't hear enough about how it impacts the people working on the ground, especially the communicators of climate change, the effects of climate change actually. So maybe as people on the ground, have you felt like your life's work has sometimes taken a toll on you, either physically, emotionally, mentally, and how do you overcome these feelings of anxiety or tiredness, as Milin mentioned just now?
I'm always tired.
I think entrepreneurs here are probably always tired. You hardly speak, yeah.
Look, I'm certainly not going to deny it's a thing. And, I think about climate change and decarbonisation all the time, right? To the extent that, and of course broader sustainability, to the extent that my wife was like, I can't believe you're making me do all these things, right? And, she's like, you need to take a break from thinking about this. And it's, really hard. But, and even, the vast majority of books I have on my shelf are climate related, right? It's not the sort of thing you read for fun, but I don't know, I enjoy, I guess, improving my knowledge in that area. So, look, I really view it through a lens of, I'm really doing everything that I personally can, right? So I don't have any sort of thought that, you know, I'm going to save the world, I'm going to stop climate change. That's ridiculous. I'm just one person. But, you know, assuming I can get to sort of the end of my career and go, well, you know, I gave it a go. I did really everything I had in my power to try and enable this and to communicate as much as I can and to work with businesses and work with emitters to try and decarbonise them. And, you know, I've got to be satisfied with that, right? And, yeah, it can be difficult, but I just think about sort of that mission at the end of the day. It's probably the best way to describe it. You know, I'm just focused on where can I have the biggest impact personally, right? And I've tried a few places, whether it's in the big emitter or in a consulting company, or, you know, now what I'm doing with a technology platform. But yeah, that's, I guess, the thing that keeps me motivated. I'm not going to lie, I do need to take time out from time to time and maybe think about something else and go for a ride on my bike or, you know, do something. But I'm also, I guess, maybe typical entrepreneur, really terrible at work-life balance, right? And so there's a couple of my team here tonight, and you guys need good work-life balance. But yeah, I think it's important to sort of take that time and decompress and, you know, read a fiction book or something. So I have 3 books on my bookshelf, on my bedside table right now, and one of them is a fiction book. So the other 2 are about climate change. But, yeah.
Mei-Lin, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of what Mark covered, like, you know, resonates with me as well. I think, in fact, learning about the term climate anxiety is fairly new as well. And I think it's something that the much younger, my younger generation and the youth, you know, sort of relate to it a lot more than myself. I think maybe not really necessarily saying that I have a better work-life balance, but I rather I think I merge a lot of my hobbies and passion together as well, and I find joy in doing it. I think the anxiety comes more so from, you know, not really being certain whether what I do can fit into the bigger picture. You know, we talk about how, like, very, very briefly, you know, I study about clams, and I always get that same question is, why do you study clams? Like, what kind of roles do they play in the bigger picture of things? They're just one thing in the coral reefs. Why aren't you studying corals, where you know 90% of my colleagues are doing? So why am I that 0.1% doing something different? So I kind of realize that, you know, everything plays a role. I mean, like, from a scientific perspective, and if we have analogies, like, all of us have a certain role in our community and society as well, and it's the same thing for, you know, ecosystems and habitats like that. So, you know, I look to it by, you know, finding analogies and making sure that, you know, people can understand it better. And for me also, because, you know, being a mom of 2 very young girls right now, you know, I worry about their future. I worry about whether they can still see giant clams when they are my age or when they turn 20. And that's what I look forward to right now. The work that I do now will have an impact on them. And that's a really short term. I'm not even looking at, like, 50 years down the road. It's really just when they turn 10 and they actually understand what mommy is doing in the lab. You know, like, my little girl actually asked me, like, can I go to the lab and clean snails? I was like, okay, sure, why not? And that brings me a lot of joy because, you know, it might just be cleaning snails, but at least she kind of can see that connection and relationship with nature, which I think that's something that I feel that's important to try and build as we go along. Does anybody have any questions for them? Yes, Ibnor? Hello, Ibnor.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Ibnor. So I'm a floating gardener, so I build floating gardens. And so I have a question for Mei-Lin. One, it's about the private sector. How can private sector get involved in ocean sustainability, ocean protection? And then for Mark, my question is more on decarbonization. Like, you're from Australia, and then now we are in Asia. Do you see it becoming... do people in Asia really understand decarbonization? Not really. the setbacks you're facing, how do you communicate that better? Yeah.
Okay. You go first.
Well, I continue to struggle to find roles. I mean, not even for myself as an academic person, because I consider myself as a, with the 3 Ps, I'm public as well, because, university also publicly funded. So, because we're still somewhat in a silo, like for me to really reach out to work with private sector or people in the private sector I still rely a lot on people knowing what I do first. Yeah, because I don't know where everyone is as well, and especially this space is growing with time. Previously, I think private sectors, maybe like what Mark also shared a little bit, different goals, different aspirations, but now there's a lot more movement or shift towards like incorporating the concept of sustainability. And then that's where they start to look into maybe a little bit of the science, people who works in this field, and then we start to have that whole, collaboration, right? So it's definitely still a work in progress. And I don't quite have an answer for it. I think this is where I feel being in this space right now, meeting everyone who's have not met a scientist or like know what a scientist in Singapore does. That's precisely why I feel the work that I do or even being present here helps a lot to get conversations started. Yeah.
So I guess, do people in this region understand decarbonisation? So I think yes, although I must say I did a presentation to a whole bunch of people from across the region, and they actually didn't understand the word decarbonisation or what it represented. I'm like, oh, okay. That's a note to self. I must try and think of another way. But yeah, the answer is yes and no, right? I think conceptually there's some understanding. We're missing a little bit in the actual how. What's the next step? What are the things we can...
So I think we will move on to the networking segment right now. Thank you so much, everybody, for listening patiently and sitting down here, squeezing cozily with each other. I will leave you guys to the networking session, and thank you very much, everybody. I will see you guys later. Thank you so much, Lucas.